Boom. Video on. How about that? Okay, we need something here. Fucking keys. Sure. Keys don't fucking work. Yeah, whatever. That's good enough. Okay. Alright, we are gonna do something beautiful today, and that is read some more of the fucking book. Woohoo! I'm so excited. Okay, we've gone pretty far. There we go. Alright, we are gonna do the chapter The Smiling Oncologist. And there are two quotes. Few doctors in this country seem to be involved with the non-life-threatening side effects of cancer therapy. In the United States, baldness, nausea and vomiting, diarrhea, clogged veins, financial problems, broken marriages, disturbed children, loss of libido, loss of self-esteem, and body image are nurses' turf. And that is from Rose Kushner. And the other quote is, and it is solely by risking life that freedom is obtained. And that is by just someone named Hegel. Just had to close the door there. Alright. The ominous toppling of radical surgery off its pedestal may have given cancer chemotherapists some pause for reckoning, but they has their own fantasy of radicalism to fulfill, their own radical arsenal to launch against cancer. Surgery, the traditional battle axe against cancer, was considered too primitive, too indiscriminate, and too weary. A large-scale chemotherapeutic attack, as one doctor put it, was needed to obliterate cancer. Every battle needs its iconic battleground, and if one physical place epitomized the cancer wars of the late 1970s, it was the chemotherapy ward. It was our trench and our bunker, a chemotherapist recalls. A space marked indelibly in the history of cancer. To enter the ward, that was my other phone, sorry. To enter the ward was to acquire automatic citizenship, as Susan Sontag might have put it, into the kingdom of the ill. The journalist Stuart Alsop was confined to one such ward at the NIH in 1973 for the treatment of a rare and unidentifiable blood condition. Crossing its threshold, he encountered a sanitized version of hell. Wandering about the NIH Clinical Center, in the corridors or in the elevator, one comes occasionally on a human monster, on a living nightmare, on our face or body hideously deformed, he wrote. Patients, even disguised in civilian clothes, could still be identified by the orange tinge that chemotherapy left on their skin, underneath which lurked the unique pallor of cancer-related anemia. The space was limbo-like, with no simple means of egress, no exit. In the glass-paneled sanatorium, where patients walked for leisure, Alsop recalled, the windows were covered in heavy wire mesh to prevent the men and women confined in the wards from jumping off the banisters and committing superslide. A collective amnesia prevailed in these wards. If remembering was an essential requisite for survival, then so was forgetting. Although this was a cancer ward, an anthropologist wrote, the word cancer was actively avoided by staff and patients. Patients lived by the regulations, accepted roles, a predetermined routine, constant stimuli. The artifice of manufactured cheer, a requirement for soldiers in battle, made the wards even more poignantly desolate. In one wing, where a woman lay dying from breast cancer, there were yellow and orange walls in the corridors, beige and white stripes in the patients' rooms. At the NIH, in an attempt to inject optimism into the wards, the nurses wore uniforms with plastic yellow buttons with the cartoonish outline of a smiling face. These wards created not just a physiological isolation chamber, but also a physical microenvironment, a sterile bubble, or the choral theory of cancer chemotherapy, that is, eradicating cancer with a death-defying bombardment of drugs, could be adequately tested. It was undeniably an experiment. At the NIH, Alsop wrote pointedly, saving the individual patient is not the essential mission. Enormous efforts are made to do so, or at least to prolong the patient's life to the last possible moment. But the basic purpose is not to save that patient's particular life, but to find means of saving the lives of others. And that is the first break now. Alright, we'll plan to do 3 chapters in this blog. In some cases, the experiment worked. In 1976, the year that the NSABP-04 trial struggled to its midpoint, a novel drug, cisplatin, appeared in the cancer wards. Cisplatin, short for cisplatinum, was a new drug forged out of an old one. Its molecular structure, a central planar platinum atom with 4 arms extending outwards, had been described back in the 1890s. But chemists had never found an application for cisplatin. The beautiful, satisfyingly symmetric chemical structure had no obvious human use. It had been shelved away in the laboratory in relative obscurity. No one had bothered to test its biological effects. In 1965, at Michigan State University, a biophysicist, Barnett Rosenberg, began to investigate whether electrical currents might stimulate bacterial cell division. Rosenberg devised a bacterial flask through which an electrical current could be run using 2 platinum electrodes. When Rosenberg turned the electricity on, he found, astonishingly, that the bacterial cells stopped dividing entirely. Rosenberg initially proposed that the electrical current was the active agent in inhibiting cell division, but the electricity, he soon determined, was merely a bystander. The platinum electrode had reacted with the salt in the bacterial solution to generate a new growth-arresting molecule that had diffused throughout the liquid. That chemical was cisplatin. Like all cells, bacteria needed to replicate DNA in order to divide. Cisplatin had chemically attacked DNA with its reactive molecular arms, cross-linking and damaging the molecule irreparably, forcing cells to arrest their division. And that is the second break. Yeah, there are a lot of these. I'm gonna put the book on the table now, because having to sit like this, oof. You heard my neck crack, didn't you? Okay, let's keep going. For patients such as John Cleland, cisplatin came to epitomize the new breed of aggressive chemotherapeutics of the 1970s. In 1973, Cleland was a 22-year-old veterinary student in Indiana. In August that year, 2 months after his marriage, he discovered a rapidly expanding lump in his right testis. He saw a urologist on a Tuesday afternoon in November. On Thursday, he was whisked off to the operating room for surgery. He returned with a scar that is extended from his abdomen to his breastbone. The diagnosis was metastatic testicular cancer of the testes that had migrated diffusely into his lymph nodes and lungs. In 1973, the survival rate from metastatic testes cancer was less than 5%. Cleland entered the cancer ward at Indiana University and began treatment with a young oncologist named Larry Einhorn. The regimen, a weather-beaten and toxic 3-drug cocktail called ABO that had been derived from the NCI studies in the 1960s, was only marginally effective. Cleland lived in and out of the hospital. His weight shrank from 158 to 106 pounds. One day in 1974, while he was still receiving chemo, his wife suggested that they sit outside to enjoy the afternoon. Cleland realized, to his utter shame, that he was too weak to stand up. He was carried to his bed like a baby, weeping with embarrassment. Man, I want to be carried like a baby. In the fall of 1974, the ABO regimen was stopped. he was switched to another equally ineffective drug. Einhorn suggested a last-ditch effort, a new chemical called cisplatin. Other researchers had seen some responses in patients with testicular cancer treated with single-agent cisplatin, although not durable ones. Einhorn wanted to combine cisplatin with 2 other drugs to see if he could increase the response rate. There was the uncertainty of a new combination and the certainty of death. On October 7, 1974, Cleland took the gamble. He enrolled as Patient Zero for BVP, the acronym for a new regimen containing bleomycin, vinblastine, and cisplatin, abbreviated P for platinum. 10 days later, when he returned from his routine scans, the tumors in his lungs had vanished. Ecstatic and mystified, he called his wife from a hospital phone. I cannot remember what I said, but I told her. Cleland's experience was typical. By 1975, Einhorn had treated 20 additional patients with the regimen and found dramatic and sustained responses virtually unheard of in the history of the disease. Einhorn presented his data at the annual meeting of oncologists held in Toronto in the winter of 1975. Walking up to that podium was like my own walk to the moon, he recalled. By the late winter of 1976, it was becoming progressively clear that some of his patients would not relapse at all. Einhorn had cured a solid cancer by chemotherapy. It was unforgettable. In my own naive mind, I thought this was the formula that we had been missing all the while. And that was the third break. And let's just keep going, because from here on, it's pretty much the end of the chapter. Cisplatin was unforgettable in more than one sense. The drug provoked an unremitting nausea, a queasiness of such penetrating force and quality that had been rarely encountered in the history of medicine. On average, patients treated with the drug vomited 12 times a day. In the 1970s, there were few effective anti-nausea drugs. Most patients had to be given intravenous fluids to tide them through the nausea. Some survived by smuggling marijuana, a mild antiemetic, into the chemotherapy wards. In Margaret Edson's play Wit, a scathing depiction of a woman's battle with ovarian cancer, an English professor undergoing chemotherapy clutches a nausea basin on the floor of her hospital ward, dry heaving in guttural agony, prompting her unforgettable aide, "You may think my vocabulary has taken..." It's prompting her unforgettable aside, "You may think my vocabulary has taken a turn for the Anglo-Saxon." That's funny. That's funny as hell. The pharmacological culprit lurking unmentioned behind the scene is cisplatin. Even today, nurses on oncology floors who tended to patients in the early 1980s, before the advent of newer antiemetics that would somewhat ease the effect of the drug, can vividly recollect the violent jolts of nausea that suddenly descended on patients and brought them dry heaving to the ground. This is also funny. In nursing slang, the drug came to me known as cisplatin. These side effects, however revolting, were considered minor dues to pay for an otherwise miraculous drug. Cisplatin was touted as the epic chemotherapeutic product of the late 1970s, the quintessential example of how curing cancer involved pushing patients nearly to the brink of death. By 1978, cisplatin-based chemotherapy was the new vogue in cancer pharmacology. Every conceivable combination was being tested on thousands of patients across America. The lemon yellow chemical dripping through intravenous lines was as ubiquitous in the cancer wards as the patients clutching their nausea basins afterwards. The NCI, meanwhile, was turning into a factory of toxins. The influx of money from the National Cancer Act had potently stimulated the Institute's drug discovery program, which had grown into an even more gargantuan effort and was testing hundreds of thousands of chemicals each year to discover new cytotoxic drugs. The strategy of discovery was empirical, throwing chemicals at cancer cells in test tubes to identify cancer killers, but by now unabashedly and defiantly so. The biology of cancer was still poorly understood, but the notion that even relatively indiscriminate cytotoxic agents discovered largely by accident would cure cancer had captivated oncology. We want and need and seek better guidance and are gaining it, Howard Skipper admitted in 1971. But we cannot afford to sit and wait for the promise of tomorrow so long as stepwise progress can be made with tools at hand today. Ehrlich's seductive phrase, magic bullet, had seemingly been foreshortened. What this war needed was simply bullets, whether magical or not, to annihilate cancer. Chemicals thus came pouring out of the NCI's cauldrons, each one with a unique personality. There was Taxol, 1 gram purified from the bark of 100 Pacific yew trees, whose molecular structure resembled a winged insect. Adriamycin, discovered in 1969, was blood red. It was the chemical responsible for the orange-red tinge that Alsop had seen at the NCI's cancer ward. Even at therapeutic doses, it could irreversibly damage the heart. Etoposide came from the fruit of the poisonous mayapple. Bleomycin, which could scar lungs without warning, was an antibiotic derived from a mold. Did we believe that we were going to cure cancer with these chemicals? George Kanellos recalled. Absolutely we did. The NCI was a charged place. The chief, Zubrod, wanted the boys to move into solid tumors. I proposed ovarian cancer. Others proposed breast cancer. We wanted to get started on the larger clinical problems. We spoke of curing cancer as if it was almost a given. In the mid-1970s, high-dose combination chemotherapy scored another sentinel victory. Burkitt's lymphoma, the tumor originally discovered in Eastern Africa and rarely found in children and adolescents in America and Europe, was cured with a cocktail of 7 drugs, including a molecular cousin of nitrogen mustard, a regimen concocted at the NCI by Ian McGrath and John Ziegler. The felling of yet another aggressive tumor by combination chemotherapy even more potently boosted the Institute's confidence, once again underscoring the likelihood that the generic solution to cancer had been found. Events outside the world of medicine also impinged on oncology, ingesting new blood and verve into the Institute. In the early 1970s, young doctors who opposed the Vietnam War flooded to the NCI. Due to an obscure legal clause, enrollment on a federal research program such as the NIH exempted someone from the draft. The undrafted soldiers of one battle were thus channeled into another. Our applications skyrocketed. They were brilliant and energetic, these new fellows at the Institute, Kanellos said. They wanted to run new trials, to test new permutations of drugs. We were a charged place. At the NCI and in its academic outposts around the world, the names of regimens evolved into a language of their own. ABVD, BEP, CMOP, CLAVIP, CHOP, and ACT. There is no cancer that is not potentially curable, an ovarian cancer chemotherapist self-assuredly told the media at a conference in 1979. The chances in some cases are infinitesimal, but the potential is still there. This is about all that patients need to know, and it is about all that patients want to know. The greatly expanded coffers of the NCI also stimulated enormous, expensive, multi-institutional trials, allowing academic centers to trot out even more powerful permutations of cytotoxic drugs. Cancer hospitals, also boosted by the NCI's grants, organized themselves into efficient and thrumming trial-running machines. By 1979, the NCI had recognized 20 so-called comprehensive cancer centers spread across the nation, hospitals with large wards dedicated exclusively to cancer, run by specialized teams of surgeons and chemotherapists and supported by psychiatrists, pathologists, radiologists, social workers, and ancillary staff. Hospital review boards that approved and coordinated human experimentation were revamped to allow researchers to bulldoze their way through institutional delays. It was trial and error on a giant human scale, with the emphasis, it seemed at times, distinctly on error. One NCI-sponsored trial tried to outdo Einhorn by doubling the dose of cisplatin in testicular cancer. Toxicity doubled, although there was no additional therapeutic effect. In another particularly tenacious trial, known as the 8-in-1 study, children with brain tumors were given 8 drugs in a single day. Predictably, horrific complications ensued. 15% of the patients needed blood transfusions. 6% were hospitalized with life-threatening infections. 14% of the children suffered kidney damage. 3 lost their hearing. 1 patient died of septic shock. Yet, despite the punishing escalation of drugs and doses, the efficacy of the drug regimen remained minimal. Most of the children in the 8-in-1 trial died soon afterwards, having only marginally responded to chemotherapy. The pattern was repeated with tiresome regularity for many forms of cancer. In metastatic lung cancer, for instance, combination chemotherapy was found to increase survival by 3 or 4 months, in colon cancer by less than 6 months, in breast by about 12. I do not mean to belittle the impact of 12 or 13 months of survival. One extra year can carry a lifetime of meaning for a man or woman condemned to death from cancer. But it took a particularly fanatical form of zeal to refuse to recognize that this was far from a cure. Between 1984 and 1985, at the midpoint of the most aggressive expansion of chemotherapy, nearly 6,000 articles were published on the subject in medical journals. Not a single article reported on a new strategy for the definitive cure of an advanced solid tumor by means of combination chemotherapy alone. Like lunatic cartographers, chemotherapists frantically drew and redrew their strategies to annihilate cancer. MOP, the combination that had proved successful in Hodgkin's disease, went through every conceivable permutation for breast, lung, and ovarian cancer. More combinations entered clinical trials, each more aggressive than its precursor, and each tagged by its own cryptic, nearly indecipherable name. Rose Kushner, by then a member of the National Cancer Advisory Board, warned against the growing disconnect between doctors and their patients. When doctors say that the side effects are tolerable or acceptable, they are talking about life-threatening things, she wrote. But if you just vomit so hard that you break the blood vessels in your eyes, they don't consider that even mentionable, and they certainly don't care if you're bald. She wrote sarcastically, "The smiling oncologist does not know whether his patients vomit or not." The language of suffering had parted, with the smiling oncologist on one side and his patients on the other. In Edson's Wit, a work not kind to the medical profession, a young oncologist, drunk with the arrogance of power, personifies the divides as he spouts out lists of nonsensical drugs and combinations, while his patient, the English professor, watches with mute terror and fury. Hexamethylphosphacil with vinplatin to potentiate hex at 300 milligrams per meter squared, vin at 100. Today is cycle 2, day 3, both cycles at the full dose. And that's the end of the chapter, and we'll continue on to the second. It's around the same length as the first. And this is called Knowing the Enemy. We have one quote, and this is by someone very recognizable in the modern age. "It is said that if you know your enemies and know yourself, you will not be imperiled in 100 battles. If you do not know your enemies but do know yourself, you will win one and lose one. If you do not know yourself nor your enemies, you will be imperiled in every single battle." as the armada of cytotoxic therapy readied itself for even more aggressive battles against cancer. A few dissenting voices began to be heard among its peripheries. These voices were connected by two common themes. First, the dissidents argued that indiscriminate chemotherapy, the unloading of barrel after barrel of poisoning drugs, could not be the only strategy by which to attack cancer. Contrary to prevailing dogma, cancer cells possess unique and specific vulnerabilities that rendered them particularly sensitive to certain chemicals that had little impact on normal cells. Second, such chemicals could only be discovered by uncovering the deep biology of every cancer cell. Cancer-specific therapies existed, but they could only be known from the bottom up, i.e. from solving the basic biological riddles of each form of cancer rather than from the top down, by maximizing cytotoxic chemotherapy or by discovering cellular poisons empirically. To attack a cancer cell specifically, one needed to begin by identifying its biological behavior, its genetic makeup, and its unique vulnerabilities. The search for magical bullets needed to begin with an understanding of cancer's magical targets. Sorry. Oh, man. Oh. The most powerful such voice arose from the most unlikely of sources, a urological surgeon, Charles Huggins, who was neither a cell biologist nor even a cancer biologist, but rather a physiologist interested in glandular secretions. Born in Nova Scotia in 1901, Huggins attended Harvard Medical School in the early 1920s, where he intersected briefly with Farber, and trained as a general surgeon in Michigan. In 1927, at age 26, he was appointed to the faculty of the University of Chicago as a urological surgeon, a specialist in diseases of the bladder, kidney, genitals, and prostate. Huggins' appointment epitomized the confidence and hubris of surgery. He possessed no formal training in urology, nor had he trained as a cancer surgeon. It was an era when surgical specialization was still a fluid concept. If a man could remove an appendix or a lymph node, the philosophy ran, he could certainly learn to remove a kidney. Huggins thus learned urology on the fly by cramming a textbook in about 6 weeks. He arrived optimistically in Chicago, expecting to find a busy, flourishing practice, but his new clinic, housed inside a stony neo-Gothic tower, remained empty all winter. The fluidity of surgical specialization was, perhaps, not as reassuring to patients. Tired of memorizing books and journals in an empty, drafty waiting room, Huggins changed tracks and set up a laboratory to study urological diseases while waiting for patients to come to his clinic. I'm mixing up my W's and R's. It's bothering me. It's bothering me. To choose a medical specialty is also to choose its cardinal bodily liquid. Hematologists have blood. Hepatologists have bile. Huggins had prostatic fluid, a runny straw-covered mixture of salt and sugar meant to lubricate and nourish sperm. Its source, the prostate, is a small gland buried deep in the perineum, wrapped around the outlet of the urinary tract in men. Vesalius was the first to identify it and draw it into human anatomy. Walnut-shaped and only walnut size, it is yet ferociously the site of cancer. Prostate cancer represents a full third of all cancer incidents in men, sixfold that of leukemia and lymphoma. In autopsies of men over 60 years old, nearly 1 in 3 specimens will bear some evidence of prostatic malignancy. But although an astoundingly common form of cancer, prostate cancer is also highly variable in its clinical course. Most cases are indolent. Elderly men usually die with prostate cancer than die of prostate cancer. But in other patients, the disease can be aggressive and invasive, capable of exploding into painful lesions in the bones and lymph nodes in its advanced metastatic form. Whew. Yo, cancer in the balls is no joke. Huggins, though, was far less interested in cancer than in the physiology of prostatic fluid. Female hormones, such as estrogen, were known to control the growth of breast tissue. Did male hormones, by analogy, control the growth of the normal prostate, and thus regulate the secretion of its principal product, prostatic fluid? By the late 1920s, Huggins had devised an apparatus to collect precious drops of prostatic fluid from dogs. Hey yo, what the fuck? Imagine getting imagine getting cum from dogs. Wow. He diverted urine away by inserting a catheter into the bladder and stitched a collection tube to the exit of the prostate gland. It was the only surgical innovation that he would devise in his lifetime. Yeah, I'm sure. If you create a little machine to collect cum liquid out of dogs, I'm really not sure what else is going on in that mind other than what the fuck. Huggins now had a tool to measure prostatic function. He could quantify the amount of fluid produced by the gland. He found that if he surgically removed the testicles of his dogs, and thereby depleted the dogs of the hormone testosterone, the prostate gland involuted and shriveled, and the fluid secretion dried up precipitously. If he injected the castrated dogs with purified testosterone, the exogenous hormones saved the prostate from shriveling. Prostate cells were thus acutely dependent on the hormones testosterone for their growth and function. Female sexual hormones kept breast cells alive. Male hormones had a similar effect on prostate cells. Oh, my neck's been bending down all this time. Oof. Huggins wanted to delve further into the metabolism of testosterone and a prostate cell, but his experiments were hampered by a peculiar problem. Dogs, humans, and lions are the only animals known to develop prostate cancer, and dogs with sizable prostate tumors kept appearing in his lab during his studies. It was vexatious to encounter a dog with a prostatic tumor during a metabolic study, he wrote. His first impulse was to cull the cancer-afflicted dogs from his study and continue single-mindedly with his fluid collection. But then a question formed in his mind. If testosterone deprivation could shrink normal prostate cells, what might testosterone deprivation do to cancer cells? The answer, as any self-respecting cancer biologist might have informed him, was almost certain: very little. Cancer cells, after all, were deranged, uninhibited, and altered, responsive only to the most poisonous combinations of drugs. The signals and hormones that regulated normal cells had long been flung aside. What remained was a cell driven to divide with such pathological and autonomous fecundity that it had erased all memory of normalcy. But Huggins knew that certain forms of cancer did not obey this principle. Variations of thyroid cancer, for instance, continue to make thyroid hormone, the growth-stimulating molecule secreted by the normal thyroid gland. Even though cancerous, these cells remembered their former selves. Huggins found that prostate cancer cells also retained the physiological memory of their origin. When he removed the testicles of prostate cancer-bearing dogs, thus acutely depriving the cancer cells of testosterone, the tumors also involuted within days. In fact, if normal prostate cells were dependent on testosterone for survival, the malignant prostate cells were nearly addicted to the hormone, so much so that acute withdrawal acted like the most powerful therapeutic drug conceivable. Cancer is not necessarily autonomous and intrinsically self-perpetuating, Huggins wrote. Its growth can be sustained and propagated by hormonal function in the host. The link between the growth sustenance of normal cells and of cancer cells was much closer than previously imagined. Cancer could be fed and nurtured by our own bodies. Oh dear, I hope I don't get prostate cancer. I don't want to get my balls chopped. Even though I am, according to the Chinese zodiac, a dog. Alright, that was a break, by the way. Surgical castration, fortunately, was not the only means to starve prostate cancer cells. Oh, good. If male hormones were driving the growth of these cancer cells, Huggins reasoned, then rather than eliminate the male hormones, what if one tricked the cancer into thinking the body was female by suppressing the effect of testosterone? So we got a gender swap. Okay. Alright, whatevs. In 1929, Edward Doisy, a biochemist, had tried to identify the hormonal factors in the estrous cycle of females. Doisy had collected hundreds of gallons of urine from pregnant women in enormous copper vats, then extracted a few milligrams of a hormone called estrogen. What the fuck are these scientists doing? If I could, collect gallons of pregnant female piss, everyone would be calling me insane. But science demands progress, right? Alright. Doisy's extraction had sparked a race to produce estrogen or its analog in large quantities. By the mid-1940s, several laboratories and pharmaceutical companies, jostling to capture the market for the essence of femininities, raced to synthesize analogs of estrogen or to find novel means to purify it efficiently. The two most widely used versions of the drugs were diethylstilbestrol, or DES, and artificial estrogen chemically synthesized by biochemists in London, or Premarin, natural estrogen purified from horse's urine in Montreal. The synthetic analog DES will return in a more sinister form in subsequent pages. Both Premarin, its name derived from pregnant mare urine, and DES were initially marketed as elixirs to cure menopause. This won't be the only time women receive liquids from horses, if you get what I mean. Anyways, but for Huggins, the existence of synthetic estrogens suggested a markedly different use. He could inject them to feminize the male body and stop the production of testosterone in patients with prostate cancer. He called the method chemical castration, and once again he found striking responses. As with surgical castration, patients with aggressive prostate cancer chemically castrated with feminizing hormones responded briskly to the therapy, often with minimal side effects. The most prominent complaint among men was the occurrence of menopause-like hot flashes. Prostate cancer was not cured with these steroids. Patients inevitably relapsed with cancer that had become more resistant to hormone therapy. But the remissions, which often stretched into several months, proved that hormonal manipulations could choke the growth of a hormone-dependent cancer. To produce a cancer remission, one did not need a toxic, indiscriminate cellular poison, such as cisplatin or nitrogen mustard. Okay, this is a very interesting chapter. Let's keep going. If prostate cancer could be starved to near death by choking off testosterone, then could hormonal deprivation be applied to starve another hormone-dependent cancer? There was at least one obvious candidate, breast cancer. In the late 1890s, an adventurous Scottish surgeon named George Beatson, trying to devise new surgical methods to treat breast cancer, had learned from shepherds in the Scottish Highlands that the removal of ovaries from cows altered their capacity to lactate and changed the quality of their udders. Beatson did not understand the basis for this phenomenon. Estrogen, the ovarian hormone, had not yet been discovered by Doisy. But intrigued by the inexplicable link between ovaries and breasts, as we all are, Beatson had surgically removed the ovaries of 3 women with breast cancer. In an age before the hormonal circuits between the ovary and breast were even remotely established, this was unorthodox beyond description, like removing the lung to cure a brain lesion. But to Beatson's astonishment, his 3 cases revealed marked responses to the ovarian removal. The breast tumors shrank dramatically. When surgeons in London tried to repeat Beatson's findings on a larger group of women, the operation led to a more nuanced outcome. Only about 2/3 of all women with breast cancer responded. This hit-and-miss quality of the benefit mystified 19th century physiologists. It is impossible to tell beforehand whether any benefit will result from the operation or not, its effects being quite uncertain. as Sernger wrote in 1902. How might the surgical removal of a faraway organ affect the growth of cancer? And why, tantalizingly, had only a fraction of cases responded? The phenomenon almost brought back memories of a mysterious humoral factor circulating in the body, of Galen's black bile. But why was this humoral factor only active in certain women with breast cancer? And that is another break. Okay, there's 3 pages left in this chapter, and then we got one more whole chapter to do. Whew. Nearly 3 decades later, Doisey's discovery of estrogen provided a partial answer to the first question. Estrogen is the principal hormone secreted by the ovaries. As with testosterone for the normal prostate, estrogen was soon demonstrated to be a vital hormone for the maintenance and growth of normal breast tissue. Was breast cancer also fueled by estrogen from the ovaries? Sorry. If so, what of Beatson's puzzle? Why did some breast cancers shrink with ovarian removal, while others remained totally unresponsive? In the mid-1960s, working closely with Huggins, a young chemist in Chicago, Elwood Jensen, came close to solving Beatson's riddle. Jensen began his studies not with cancer cells, but with the normal physiology of estrogen. Hormones, Jensen knew, typically work by binding to a receptor in the target cell, but the receptor for the steroid hormone estrogen had remained elusive. Using a radioactively labeled version of the hormone as bait, in 1968, Jensen found the estrogen receptor, the molecule responsible for binding estrogen and relaying its signal to the cell. Jensen now asked whether breast cancer cells also uniformly possess this receptor. Unexpectedly, some did and some did not. Indeed, breast cancer cases can be neatly divided into 2 types, ones with cancer cells that expressed high levels of this receptor, and those that expressed low levels, ER-positive and ER-negative tumors. Jensen's observations suggested a possible solution to Beatson's riddle. Perhaps the marked variation of breast cancer cells in response to ovarian removal depended on whether the cancer cells expressed the estrogen receptor or not. ER-positive tumors possessing the receptor retained their hunger for estrogen. ER-negative tumors had rid themselves of both the receptor and the hormone dependence. ER-positive tumors thus responded to Beatson's surgery, Jensen proposed, while ER-negative tumors were unresponsive. The simplest way to prove the theory was to launch an experiment, to perform Beatson's surgery on women with ER-positive and ER-negative tumors and determine whether the receptor status of the cancer cells was predictive of the response. But the surgical procedure had fallen out of fashion. Ovarian removal produced many other severe side effects, such as osteoporosis. An alternative was to use a pharmacological means to inhibit estrogen function, a female version of chemical castration a la Huggins. But Jensen had no such drug. Testosterone did not work, and no synthetic anti-estrogen was in development. In their dogged pursuit of cures for menopause and for new contraceptive agents using synthetic estrogens, pharmaceutical companies had long abandoned the development of an anti-estrogen, and there was no interest in developing an anti-estrogen for cancer. In an era gripped by the hypnotic promise of cytotoxic chemotherapy, as Jensen put it, there was little enthusiasm about developing endocrine hormonal therapies to treat cancer. Combination chemotherapy was thought to be more likely to be successful in curing not only breast cancer, but also solid tumors. Developing an anti-estrogen, an antagonist to the fabled elixir of female youth, was widely considered a waste of effort, money, and time. Scarcely anyone paid notice then. Oh, sorry, this is after the break, but we're driving right along. Scarcely anyone paid notice then, on September 13, 1962, when a team of talented British chemists from Empirical Chemical Industries, ICI, filed a patent for the chemical named ICI 46474, or tamoxifen. Originally invented as a birth control pill, tamoxifen had been synthesized by a team led by the hormone biologist Arthur Walpole and a synthetic chemist, Dora Richardson, both members of the fertility control program of the ICI. I keep on trying to say NCI. But even though structurally designed to be a potent stimulator of estrogen, its winged bird-like skeleton designed to perch perfectly onto the open arms of the estrogen receptor, tamoxifen had turned out to have exactly the opposite effect. Rather than turning on the estrogen signal, a requirement for a contraceptive drug, it had surprisingly shut it off in many tissues. It was an estrogen antagonist, thus considered a virtually useless drug. Yet the connection between fertility drugs and cancer preoccupied Walpole. He knew of Huggins' experiments with surgical castration by prostate cancer. He knew of Beatson's riddle, almost solved by Jensen. The anti-estrogenic properties of this new drug raised an intriguing possibility. ICI may be a useless contraceptive, but perhaps, he reasoned, it might be useful against estrogen-sensitive breast cancer. To test that idea, Walpole and Richardson sought a clinical collaborator. The natural site for such a trial was immediately apparent: the sprawling Christie Hospital in Manchester, a world-renowned cancer center just a short ride through the undulating hills of Cheshire from ICI's research campus at Alderley Park. I choked on my own spit. And there was a natural collaborator, Mary Cole, a Manchester oncologist and radiotherapist with a particular interest in breast cancer. Known affectionately as Moya by her patients and colleagues, Cole had a reputation as a feisty and meticulous physician, intensely dedicated to her patients. She had a ward full of women with advanced metastatic breast cancer, many of them hurtling inexorably towards their death. Moya Cole was willing to try anything, even an abandoned contraceptive, to save the lives of these women. Cole's trial was launched at Christie in the late summer of 1969. 46 women with breast cancer were treated with tablets of ICI 46474. Cole expected little from the drug, at best a partial response, but in 10 patients, the response was immediately obvious. Tumors shriveled visibly in the breast. Lung metastases shrank. Bone pain flickered away and lymph nodes softened. Like Huggins' prostate cancer patients, many of the women who responded to the drug eventually relapsed. But the success of the trial was incontrovertible, and the proof of principle historic. A drug designed to target a specific pathway in a cancer cell, not a cellular poison discovered empirically by trial and error, had successfully driven metastatic tumors into remission. Tamoxifen's journey came full circle in a little-known pharmaceutical laboratory in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts. In 1973, V. Craig Jordan, a biochemist working at the lab of the Worcester Foundation, or Worcester Foundation, I'm not British, a research institute involved in the development of new contraceptives, investigated the pattern behind cancers that did or did not respond to tamoxifen therapy. Jordan used a simple molecular technique to stain breast cancer cells for the estrogen receptor that Elwood Jensen had discovered in Chicago, and the answer to Beatson's riddle finally leaped out of the experiment. Cancer cells that expressed the estrogen receptor were highly responsive to tamoxifen, while cells that lacked the estrogen receptor did not respond. The reason behind the slippery hit-and-miss responses of women with breast cancer observed in England nearly a century earlier was now clear. Cells that expressed the estrogen receptor could bind tamoxifen, and the drug, an estrogen antagonist, shut off estrogen responsiveness, thus choking the cell's growth. But ER-negative cells lacked the receptor for the drug and thus were insensitive to it. The schema had a satisfying simplicity. For the first time in the history of cancer, a drug, its target, and a cancer cell had been conjoined by a core molecular logic. Man. 9 more pages in a third chapter. Do I want to do this? Do I want to? Honestly, sure. Gotta get some progress done. Boom, 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 boom. Alright, third chapter is called Halsted's Ashes. And we have two quotes. I would rather be ashes than dust. I think there's a song about that. I think that's by Jack London. And here's another quote. Will you turn me out if I can't get better? And that was the title of this entire part. So yes, this is from a cancer patient to her physician in the 1960s. Moya Cole's tamoxifen trial was initially designed to treat women with an advanced metastatic breast cancer. But as the trial progressed, Cole began to wonder about an alternative strategy. Typically, clinical trials of new cancer drugs tend to escalate inexorably towards sicker and sicker patients. As news of a novel drug spreads, more and more desperate patients lurch towards last-ditch efforts to save their lives. But Cole was inclined to journey in the opposite direction. What if women with earlier stage tumors were treated with tamoxifen? If a drug could halt the progression of diffusely metastatic and aggressive stage 4 cancers, might it work even better on more localized stage 2 breast cancers, cancers that had spread only to the regional lymph nodes? Unwittingly, Cole had come full circle towards Halsted's logic. Halsted had invented the radical mastectomy based on the premise that early breast cancer needed to be attacked exhaustively and definitively by surgically cleansing every conceivable reservoir of the disease, even when no cancer was present. The result had been, no visible cancer was present. The result had been the grotesque and disfiguring mastectomy, foisted indiscriminately on women with even small, locally restricted tumors to stave off relapses and metastasis into distinct organs. But Cole now wondered whether Halsted had tried to cleanse the Augean stables of cancer with all the right intentions, but with the wrong tools. Surgery could not eliminate invisible reservoirs for cancer, but perhaps what was needed was a potent chemical, a systemic therapy. Winnie Myers dreamed about after treatment from 1932. A variant of this idea had already gripped a band of renegade researchers at the NCI not even before tamoxifen had appeared on the horizon. In 1963, nearly a decade before Moya Cole completed her experiments in Manchester, a 33-year-old oncologist at the NCI, Paul Carbone, had launched a trial to see if chemotherapy might be effective when administered to women after an early-stage primary tumor had been completely removed surgically, i.e. women with no visible tumor remaining in the body. Carbone had been inspired by the patron saint of renegades at the NCI, Min-Chu Lee, the researcher who had been expelled from the Institute for treating women with placental tumors with methotrexate long after their tumors had visibly disappeared. Lee had been packed off in ignominy, but the strategy that had undone him, using chemotherapy to cleanse the body of residual tumor, had gained increasing respectability at the Institute. In his small trial, Carbone found that adding chemotherapy after surgery decreased the rate of relapse from breast cancer. To describe this form of treatment, Carbone and his team used the word adjuvant, from the Latin phrase to help. Adjuvant chemotherapy, Carbone conjectured, could be the surgeon's little helper. It would eradicate microscopic deposits of cancer left behind after surgery, thus extirpating any remnant reservoirs of malignancy in the body in early breast cancer. In essence, completing the Herculean cancer cleansing task that Halsted had set for himself. But surgeons had no interest in getting help from anyone, least of all chemotherapists. By the mid-1960s, as radical surgery became increasingly embattled, most breast surgeons had begun to view chemotherapy as estranged rivals that could not be trusted with anything, least of all improving surgical outcomes. And since surgeons largely dominated the fields of breast cancer and saw all the patients upon diagnosis, Carbone could not ramp up his trial because he could barely recruit any patients. Except for an occasional woman who underwent a mastectomy at the NCI, the study never got off the ground, Carbone recalled. But Carbone found an alternative. Shunned by surgeons, he now turned to the surgeon who had shunned its own compatriots, Bernie Fisher, the man caught in the controversial swirl of testing radical breast surgery. Fisher was instantly interested in Carbone's idea. Indeed, Fisher had been trying to run a trial along similar lines, combining chemotherapy with surgical mastectomy. But even Fisher could pick only one fight at a time. With his own trial, the NCABP4 trial, which was to test radical surgery versus non-radical surgery, barely limping along, he could hardly convince surgeons to join the trial to combine chemo and surgery in breast cancer. An Italian team came to the rescue. In 1972, as the NCI was scouring the nation for a site where adjuvant chemotherapy after surgery could be tested, the oncologist Gianni Bonadonna came to Bethesda to visit the institute. Suave, personable, and sophisticated, impeccably dressed in custom-cut Milani suit, Bonadonna made an instant impression at the NCI. He learned from DeVita, Canellos, and Carbone that they had been testing combinations of drugs to treat advanced breast cancer and had found a concoction that would likely work. Cytoxan, a cousin of nitrogen mustard, methotrexate, a variant of Farber's aminopterin, and fluorouracil, an inhibitor of DNA synthesis. The regimen, called CMF, could be tolerated with relatively minimal side effects, yet was active enough in combination to thwart microscopic tumors, an ideal combination to be used as an adjuvant in breast cancer. Bonadonna worked at a large cancer center in Milan called the Istituto Tumori, where he had a close friendship with the chief breast surgeon Umberto Veronesi. Convinced by Carbone, who was still struggling to get a similar trial launched in America, Bonadonna and Veronesi, the only surgeon-chemotherapist pair seemingly on talking terms with each other, proposed a large randomized trial to study chemotherapies after breast surgery for early-stage breast cancer. They were immediately awarded the contract for the NCI trial. The irony of that award could hardly have escaped the researchers at the Institute. In America, the landscape of cancer medicine had become so deeply gashed by internal rifts that the most important NCI-sponsored trial of cytotoxic chemotherapy had to be relocated to a foreign country. And that's a break. Oh man, we have lots of breaks ahead of us, which is nice. Let's keep going. Bonadonna began his trial in the summer of 1973. By the early winter that year, he had randomized nearly 400 women to the trial, half to no treatment and half to treatment with CMF. Veronesi was a crucial supporter, but there was still little interest from other breast surgeons. The surgeons were not just skeptical, Bonadonna recalled, they were hostile. They did not want to know. At the time, there were very few chemotherapists, and they were not rated highly, and the attitude among surgeons was chemotherapists deliver drugs and advance disease, while surgeons operate, and we have complete remission for the entire life of the patient. Surgeons rarely saw their patients again, and I think they didn't want to hear about how many patients were being failed by surgery alone. It was a matter of prestige. On an overcast morning on the winter of 1975, Bonadonna flew to Brussels to present his results at a conference of European oncologists. The trial had just finished its second year, but the two groups, Bonadonna reported, had clearly parted ways. Nearly half the women treated with no therapy had relapsed. In contrast, only a third of the women treated with the adjuvant regimen had relapsed. Adjuvant chemotherapy had prevented breast cancer relapse in about 1 in every 6 treated women. The news was so unexpected that it was greeted with a stunned silence in the auditorium. Bonadonna's presentation had shaken the terra firma of cancer chemotherapy. It was only on the flight back to Milan, 10,000 feet above the Earth, that Bonadonna was finally inundated with questions about his trial by other researchers on his flight. That's another break, but these breaks are very close together, so let's keep going. Gianni Bonadonna's remarkable Milanese trial left a question almost begging to be answered. If adjuvant CMF chemotherapy could decrease relapses in women with early-stage breast cancer, then might adjuvant tamoxifen, the other active breast cancer drug established by Cole's group, also decrease relapses in women with localized ER-positive breast cancer after surgery? Had Moya Cole been right about her instinct in treating early-stage breast cancer with anti-estrogen therapy? This was a question that Bernie Fisher, although embroiled in several other trials, could not resist trying to answer. In January 1977, 5 years after Cole had published the results on tamoxifen in metastatic cancer, Fisher recruited 1891 women with estrogen receptor positive or ER positive breast cancer that had spread only to the axillary nodes. He treated half with adjuvant tamoxifen and the other half with no tamoxifen. By 1981, the two groups had deviated sharply. Treatment with tamoxifen after surgery reduced cancer relapse rates by nearly 50%. The effect was particularly pronounced among women above 50 years old, a group most resistant to standard chemotherapy regimens and most likely to relapse with aggressive metastatic breast cancer. 3 years later, in 1985, when Fisher reanalyzed the deviating curves of relapse and survival, the effect of tamoxifen treatment was even more dramatic. Among the 500-odd women older than 50 assigned to each group, tamoxifen had prevented 55 relapses and deaths. Fisher had altered the biology of breast cancer after surgery using a targeted hormonal drug. Let's pause there. We've got 5 pages left. And my mouth is killing me. I'm gonna get some more water. Okay, let's go. By the early 1980s, brave new paradigms of treatment had thus arisen out of the ashes of old paradigms. Halsted's fantasy of attacking early-stage cancers was reborn as adjuvant therapy. Ehrlich's magic bullet for cancer was reincarnated as anti-hormone therapy for breast and prostate cancer. Neither method of treatment professed to be a complete cure. Adjuvant therapy and hormonal therapy typically did not obliterate cancer. Hormonal therapy produced prolonged remissions that could stretch into years or even decades. Adjuvant therapy was mainly a cleansing method to purge the body of residual cancer cells. It lengthened survival, but many patients eventually relapsed. In the end, often after decades of remission, chemotherapy-resistant and hormone-resistant cancers grew despite the prior interventions, flinging aside the equilibrium established during the treatment. But although these alternatives did not offer definitive cures, several important principles of cancer biology and therapy were firmly cemented in these powerful trials. First, as Kaplan had found with Hodgkin's disease, these trials again clearly etched the message that cancer was enormously heterogeneous. Breast or prostate cancers came in an array of forms, each with unique biological behaviors. The heterogeneity was genetic. In breast cancer, for instance, some variants responded to hormonal treatment, while others were hormone unresponsive, and the heterogeneity was anatomic. Some cancers were localized to the breast when detected, while others had a propensity to spread to distant organs. Second, understanding that heterogeneity was of deep consequence. That was the question. That was the sentence. Okay. Know thine enemy runs the adage, and Fisher's and Bonadonna's trials had shown that it was essential to know the cancer as intimately as possible before rushing to treat it. The meticulous separation of breast cancer into distinct stages, for instance, was a crucial prerequisite to the success of Bonadonna's study. Early-stage breast cancer could not be treated like late-stage breast cancer. The meticulous separation of ER-positive and ER-negative cancers was crucial to Fisher's study. If tamoxifen had indiscriminately been tested on ER-negative breast cancer, the drug would have been discarded as having no benefit. This nuanced understanding of cancer underscored by these trials had a sobering effect on cancer medicine. As Frank Rauscher, the director of the NCI, put it in 1985, we were all more naive a decade ago. We hoped that a single application of drugs would result in a dramatic benefit. We now understand that it's much more complicated than that. People are optimistic, but we're not expecting home runs. Right now, people would be happy with a series of singles or doubles. Yet the metaphorical potency of battling and obliterating cancer relatively indiscriminately, or one cause, one cure, still gripped oncology. Adjuvant chemotherapy and hormonal therapy were like truces declared in the battle, signs merely that a more aggressive attack was necessary. The allure of deploying a full armamentarium of cytotoxic drugs, of driving the body to the edge of death to rid it of its malignant innards, was still irresistible. So cancer medicine charged on, even if it meant relinquishing sanctity, sanity, or safety. Pumped up with self-confidence, bristling with conceit, and hypnotized by the potency of medicine, oncologists pushed their patients and their discipline to the brink of disaster. We shall so poison the atmosphere of the first act, the biologist James Watson warned about the future of cancer in 1977, that no one of decency shall want to see the play through to the end. For many cancer patients caught in the first act, there was little choice but to see the poisonous play to its end. And that is another break. Oh boy. Let's go. More is more, a patient's daughter told me curtly. I had suggested to her delicately that for some patients with cancer, less might be more. The patient was an elderly Italian woman with liver cancer that had metastasized widely throughout her abdomen. She had come to the Massachusetts General Hospital seeking chemotherapy, surgery, or radiation, if possible, all three. She spoke halting, heavily accented English, often pausing between her words to catch her breath. Her skin had a yellow-gray tinge, a tinge I was worried that would bloom into a bright jaundice if the tumor obstructed her bile duct fully and the blood began to fill up with bile pigments. Exhausted, she drifted in and out of sleep even while I was examining her. I asked her to hold the palms of her hands straight upwards, as if halting traffic, looking for signs of a subtle flapping motion that often predates liver failure. Thankfully, there was no tremor, but the abdomen had a dull, full sound of fluid building up inside it, likely full of malignant cells. The daughter was a physician, and she watched me in it with intense hawk-like eyes while I finished the exam. She was devoted to her mother, with the reversed and twice as fierce maternal instinct that marks the poignant moment of midlife where the roles of mother and daughter begin to switch. The daughter wanted the best possible cure for her mother, the best doctors, the best room, with the best view of Beacon Hill, and the best, strongest, and toughest medicine that privilege and money could buy. The elderly woman, meanwhile, would hardly tolerate even the mildest drug. Her liver had not failed yet, but was on the verge of doing so, and subtle signs suggested her kidneys were barely functioning. I suggested that we try a palliative drug, perhaps a single chemotherapeutic agent that might just alleviate her symptoms rather than pushing for a more tougher regimen to try and cure an incurable disease. The daughter looked at me as if I were mad. I came here to get treatment, not consolations about hospice, she finally said, glowering with fury. I promised to reconsider by asking more experienced doctors to weigh in. Perhaps I had been too hasty in my caution. But in a few weeks, I learned that she and her daughter had found another doctor, presumably someone who had acquiesced more readily to their demands. I do not know whether the elderly woman died from cancer or its cure. And that's the last break. Let's go. 2 more pages and we're done. We are going to be done here. Yet a third voice of dissent arose in oncology in the 1980s, although this voice had skirted the peripheries of cancer for several centuries. As trial after trial of chemotherapy and surgery failed to chisel down the mortality rate for advanced cancers, a generation of surgeons and chemotherapists, unable to cure patients, began to relearn the art of caring for patients. It was a fitful and uncomfortable lesson. Palliative care, the branch of medicine that focused on symptom relief and comfort, had been perceived as the antimatter of cancer therapy, the negative to its positive, and admission of failure to its rhetoric of success. The word palliate comes from the Latin palliare, to cloak, and providing pain relief was perceived as cloaking the essence of the illness, smothering symptoms rather than attacking disease. Writing about pain relief, a Boston surgeon thus reasoned in the 1950s, if there is persistent pain which cannot be relieved by direct surgical attack on the pathological lesion itself, relief can only be obtained by surgical interruption of sensory pathways. The only alternative to surgery was more surgery, fire to fight fire. Pain-relieving opiate drugs such as morphine and fentanyl were deliberately denied. If surgery is withheld, the writer continued, the sufferer is doomed to opiate addiction, physical deterioration, or even suicide, an ironic consideration since Halsted himself, while devising his theory of radical surgery, had swiveled between his twin addictions to cocaine and morphine. The movement to restore sanity and sanctity to the end-of-life care in cancer patients emerged, predictably, not from cure-obsessed America, but from Europe. Its founder was Cicely Saunders, a former nurse who had retrained as a physician in England. In the late 1940s, Saunders had tended to a Jewish refugee from Warsaw dying from cancer in London. The man had left Saunders his life savings, 500 euros, with the desire to be a window in her home. As Saunders entered and explored the forsaken cancer wards of London's East End in the 50s, she began to decipher that cryptic request in a more visceral sense. She encountered terminally ill patients confined, somewhat literally, to rooms without windows. These hopeless cases, Saunders found, had become the pariah of oncology, unable to find any place in its rhetoric of battle and victory, and thus pushed, like useless wounded soldiers, out of sight and out of mind. Saunders responded to this by inventing, or rather resurrecting, a counter-discipline, palliative medicine. She avoided the phrase palliative care because care, she wrote, is a soft word that would never win respectability in the medical world. If oncologists could not bring themselves to provide care for the terminally ill patients, she would leverage other specialists, psychiatrists, anesthesiologists, geriatricians, physical therapists, and neurologists to help patients die painlessly and gracefully. And she would physically remove the dying from the oncology wards. In 1967, she created a hospice in London to care specifically for the terminally ill and dying, evocatively naming it St. Christopher's, not after the patron saint of death, but after the patron saint of travelers. It would take a full decade for Saunders' movement to travel to America and penetrate its optimism-fortified oncology wards. The resistance to providing palliative care to patients, a ward nurse recalls, was so deep that doctors would not even look us in the eye when we recommended that they stop their efforts to save lives and start saving dignity instead. Doctors were allergic to the smell of death. Death made failure, defeat, their death, the death of medicine, the death of oncology. Providing end-of-life care required a colossal act of reimagination and reinvention. Trials on pain and pain relief, trials executed with no less rigor or precision than those launched to test novel drugs and surgical protocols, toppled several dogmas about pain and revealed new and unexpected foundational principles. Opiates, used liberally and compassionately on cancer patients, did not cause addiction, deterioration, or suicide. Instead, they relieved the punishing cycle of anxiety, pain, and despair. New anti-nausea drugs were deployed that vastly improved the lives of patients on chemotherapy. The first hospice in the United States was launched at Yale New Haven Hospital in 1974. By the early 1980s, hospices for cancer patients built on Saunders' model had sprouted up worldwide, most prominently in Britain, where nearly 200 hospice centers were operating by the end of that decade. Saunders refused to recognize this enterprise as pitted against cancer. The provision of terminal care, she wrote, should not be thought of as a separate and essentially negative part of the attack on cancer. This is not merely the phase of defeat, hard to contemplate and unrewarding to carry out. In many ways, its principles are fundamentally the same as those which underlie all other stages of care and treatment, although its rewards are different. This too, then, was knowing the enemy. And finally, we're done. Not done with the book, of course, but done with our 3 chapters. And there's one more chapter before part 4. Ooh boy. Okay. I'm gonna stop you. So, see you later.